Welcome to this quick webinar where we are looking at text forms and structures. This is part of a series of supports developed by the Alberta Regional Professional Development Consortia related to implementation of the English Language Arts and Literature curriculum, grades 4 to 6, providing an overview of the organizing ideas found within the curriculum. We encourage all teachers to continue to visit new.learn Alberta, not only to access digital curriculum for detailed cusps, remembering, of course, that once you find a particular outcome, if you click on that little I in the circle, it'll pop up a box that not only shows you all of the cusps listed, but will link to the resources, the competencies, and any other pertinent information related to that particular outcome. So the digital curriculum can be very helpful when it comes to planning for your students. Additionally, content around resourcing is constantly being added to the site. And so if you haven't been visited new.learn Alberta in a while, we highly recommend that you do so. Text forms and structures happens to be a rather large organizing idea in the ELAL curriculum. In grade 4, there are 5 organizing themes for these cusps. And then in grades 5 and 6, 2 more are added for a total of 7. You will notice that this particular slide also happens to be linked to a sequencing document that helps you to see at a glance how these concepts are built up through the curriculum across the grades. Here are the learning outcomes for each of the grades. And of course, we remember that the learning outcome is what we assess and report to parents. And in order to do that, we teach and assess the cusps that are included under each of the learning outcomes. A couple of key pieces of information when it comes to vocabulary or ideas that you will find as you read through this particular section of the curriculum. You will see the word form, text form, quite frequently. When we see form, think format. So it's the way that the text is presented to the reader. Examples include short stories, poems, script, essays, recipes. The list is long. So when we see form, we're going to think format. Structure means organization. So it's how the writer has organized their ideas. Structure could include a compare and contrast setup. It could be a description. It could be something in a chronological order. It could be a paragraph. It could be an epilogue. It could be flashback. It can really take on many, many different appearances. I was going to say structures, but that's the word we're talking about. So when we see structure, we're going to think organization. Elements are the building blocks of the form. So the elements of whatever the text is work together to communicate the ideas and the purpose of the text. You might not see the word element explicitly in the curriculum, but they exist because we're talking about different forms. So elements of fiction can include things like character, plot, setting, theme, conflict, point of view, author's voice or style, figurative language, literary devices, and of course, there would be elements of nonfiction as well. These are all different pieces that we see when we're looking at the form. When we're looking at text features in, say, a nonfiction text, that would be an element that helps build out the form of the report or whatever the text is that we're looking at. You're going to see the word genre in this particular organizing idea. And when we're talking about genre, we're talking about categories. Now, the thing to remember about genres is it's not like black and white. So there are different categories, obviously, that text is sorted into, and some text can live in more than one category because genres are categories of text that share some sort of a common feature. And so this particular feature might allow it to be in this category. Oh, but it also allows it to be over here because it has this other feature. And so you might find that some texts live in more than one genre. Fiction and nonfiction are kind of big, huge umbrellas related to genre. And then we get into more specificity when we get into subgenres of particular texts. Now, when I say the word text, for some folks, we automatically default into written words, and that's not the case. So a text is anything that conveys meaning to the person examining it, which could be written words, but it could also include songs, art, advertisement, dance, speeches, and even land. So when I can look at whatever it is that's in front of me, and there is meaning or information that I can glean from it, it is considered a text. Megan Tipler shared this image. It's everything around us that we consume in some way that we attach meaning or significance to is a text. The last piece that I want to point out is what I consider a very beautiful definition of fiction and nonfiction. It's not one that I've typically used before. I just discovered it. But this idea that fiction is when we learn through imagination, and nonfiction is when we learn through information. At times, fiction can be dismissed as recreational or not something that we quote unquote learn from. It's for fun. But we also know that that is not how text works. And so even those fun things, fun picture books, funny songs, poems, whatever, there are places and things we can learn from that. And so feel free to use this with your students. I've included this slide as a poster as well in the deck so that you can use it if you'd like. So here's how the next little chunk of time is going to go. There is way more content than I can squeeze into the time allotment that I've been given for this overview video. So I'm going to very quickly be going through each of these subcategories that exist for the cusps. You are going to be required to go into the slide decks to look at greater detail, as well as to access the resources and things that are linked in the slides. If you have any questions about the content in this video, please reach out to your local consortia office as they would be happy to help you. So the first set of cusps I've called organization and communication, and they are very similar to the learning outcome in the way that they've been written. In fact, I've done this presentation more than once, and every time I read this next slide, I pause because I think I've made a mistake in what I've typed. That's how similar they are. So here are the understandings that are in grades 4, 5, and 6. Essentially, for this particular cusp, students need to put together the fact that the form or the format, the structure, the organization, or even the genre can influence our personal enjoyment as well as how the ideas and information are communicated. So the fact that this is a poem influences my personal reaction to it, as well as how the ideas are communicated. So essentially, each of these boils down to this big understanding that these pieces of a text influence us in some way. And so for each of the grades, we dig into that in a little bit different way. Now, here's what you're going to notice when you look at the slides. The first slide that you'll see for the grade has no bolding or underlining or arrows. That is the cusp as written from the curriculum. However, in this video, what you're going to see is the next slide where I have bolded some key concepts, what I think are the key concepts. I have not bolded every concept. And you get to decide as a professional what are the important ones for you. So this is just my thinking and how I worked with the cusps in order to build out some teaching ideas or pieces. This is not a the only way to do this. This is not gospel. You get to decide to what extent this makes sense to you and how you want to work with it. So each of these bolded ideas are some sort of a universal big picture idea that students need to have a sense of in order to be able to do or demonstrate the certain skills and procedures. All of the verbs have been underlined because the verbs tell us how deep we need to go with our instruction and the level of which we are expecting students to produce or explain their thinking. The verbs also communicate to us how we might capture that knowledge, because not everything needs to be a pen and paper task. And so maybe there's pieces in here that students can talk about in conversation. Maybe there's things in the skills and procedures that we can observe students doing. And maybe there are verbs in here that actually require some sort of a product. So whether that's a written thing or a performance, whatever it looks like. So the verbs really are important to guide us to make sure that what we're asking of students is what we're supposed to be asking of students. The last thing you're going to notice as you look at some of these slides are arrows, because there are connections to be made within the cusps, as well as across organizing ideas in order to create efficiencies with this curriculum. So again, you don't have to do this, but I'm trying to connect some dots for you to hopefully help make this work a little bit easier. So again, we've got what it is the students are required to do. Now, when we get down here into this examine a variety of literary forms used to communicate ideas and information, it might sound like there's a lot of choices here, which technically there are. But if you go over to the knowledge column, it also tells us what those literary forms should be. So we see the word include here, which means we have to look at those in this particular grade. And so in grade 4, we're going to look at novels, journal entries, and media as a text form. Also connecting down over into the knowledge column is this idea of a narrative text. And so narrative text structures exist in all the grades. They just grow in complexity. So in grade 4, this is what we're looking at when we're talking about the pieces of a story. What does it look like? They can be categorized into these elements. Following each of the cusps, you're going to see a slide that offers some sort of support or ideas around how you might teach this particular cusp. It is not an exhaustive list. It is meant to be inspiration. So you're going to see for this particular one, a link to some anchor charts. So that We Are Teachers post. Reminder, of course, the best practice when it comes to anchor charts is that we are having conversations with our students. This one's about author's purpose. So we need to have some texts that have a variety of purposes. We're going to ask them, what are the purposes of these texts? We're going to do some sorting, and we're going to see if we can come up with some general categories to talk about purpose. And then it goes in the anchor chart. Now, you already know where the conversation is going to go because you've carefully crafted this experience for your students. But essentially, we need to make sure that we build our anchor charts alongside our students rather than print off the pretty one from the internet and stick it up on the wall, because there is no emotional attachment to the pretty thing you've laminated and stuck on the wall. But if they are involved in the process of building said chart, then they are more likely to make use of it. A suggestion here about how you can connect through the cusps. So you could choose a fantasy novel to explore narrative text structures and elements of fiction. So we can talk about some of these pieces using using a singular text. And well, novel is one of the forms that are mentioned in the cusps. Genre, which is coming up, is fantasy. And so we could look at a fantasy novel. So checking off a couple of boxes here with one piece. And of course, again, these are linked to various resources that you can choose to use, adapt and modify as needed. This particular one is a very brief overview around media texts, because as you may or may not know, media texts in and of itself is a huge collection of text. You could teach media text all year long. So when you go to work with media text, you're probably going to focus in on one or two of those forms with your students as an example of a media text. So here again, we have in grade 5, the literary text forms for fiction or nonfiction include photo essays, news articles, and hybrids. There's a more detailed narrative text structure provided in grade 5. I want to point out here that grade 5 students are expected to develop their reading stamina, which means not only do we need to practice that as a group of educators, as teachers, but they also need time to be reading in your class. Again, these are linked as resources that you can check out at your leisure. Photo essays will have a resource coming soon. Ultimately, we need to let our students read, we need to build their stamina, and we need to talk to them about their reading. So while everybody else is reading, you're shouldering up to a student at a time and just saying, talk to me about what book you're reading, what makes it great, what makes it challenging. Would you recommend this book to others? Tell me about a character. You are going to know very quickly in that conversation if the student is actually reading the book or not. And if they're not reading the book, then that's a whole other conversation about how do we pick books that we enjoy reading? How can we find something that does capture their interests and supporting them in that work? In grade 6, again, we're looking at these verbs to help us understand what is the extent of what it is they have to do. And can you observe it? Is it something that can be done in a conversation? Does it require a product of some kind? In grade 6, we're looking at articles, speeches, and hybrids. And we've kicked it up a little bit in grade 6 around the narrative text structure. So there's an understanding at this point that they get what a narrative text structure is, what the elements are that go into building a narrative form. And they can start to see how manipulating that structure can create various effects. And you're going to see a connection here shortly when we move forward into the fiction section. So again, we've got some resources here and ideas for instruction. Having book talks, whether that's inviting other teachers to come in and quickly book talk a topic or a book to your students, or you offering up a book talk to your students, inviting them to complete a book talk and using that as an oral language assignment that you're going to be gathering information from. You can implement a sticky note recommendation. So if they like the book from your classroom library, they write their name on a sticky note and stick it on the inside cover. Someone else picks up the book and they can open it up and go, so-and-so liked this book. I'm going to go ask them why they liked it. If they open up the book and see 20 sticky notes inside, well, they know it's a popular book and they should probably read it. We're going to encourage and facilitate visits to libraries, whether that is the public library or the school library. We're going to talk about what we're reading. We're trying to build a culture of readers within our school, and that has to be modeled by the adults in the building. And we're going to encourage conversations with each other about the books that they're reading, because that's one place that avid readers find their next book to read, is in conversation with other readers. And so whether that's providing them with sentence stems about how to have that conversation, building a turn and talk routine at the end of each independent reading time where they're talking to a neighbor about the book that they've read or questions that they have. They can talk about books that they've read that no one else has read it. We're simply offering a space for conversation and the possibility that the person they're talking to might also be interested in the book. That takes us to the next section, which is on text features. Again, here's how the understanding builds across the grades. I've included grade 3 here because sometimes it's handy to know where even the grade 4 kiddos are, what they're coming with as far as previous information goes. Now, things to note here. They have to look at a variety of text features, but they also need to include it, which means now we're writing something that has text features. So when we look at places where we can connect this, autobiographies and procedural texts are mentioned as nonfiction texts, and media is obviously, as I mentioned earlier, a form of fiction. So those three places might be a space where we could add images, graphics, and indexes. Now, you could also choose not to use any of these spaces, but instead connect this to maybe some research that you're doing in another subject area. In that case, when you are building the indexes, you are looking for students' use of that tier 3 vocabulary in their index building, which is another connection to an organizing idea, the organizing idea of vocabulary. So you don't have to necessarily connect to these particular text forms, but you can. You can also look to other subject areas to make those connections. In grade 5, same thing. We're looking at a variety of text features, and then we are also including them in our writing. And so in grade 5, it's about sidebars and glossaries. Where that might fit would be in editorial or opinion pieces, or perhaps in photo essays, news articles, and hybrids. Again, you're not required to put them here, but if we're looking for some connection spaces, this might work. You could also, again, connect it to that research piece out of the writing and use it in another subject area. In grade 6, we are looking at text features that are organizing content, identifying important information, and enhance understandings of text, which essentially is like the working definition of text features. But you'll notice that there isn't a list here, because in grade 6, we are looking to bring together all of the other text features, or all of the text features, sorry, that have been featured in the other grades. So here is a list of what those might be. Remembering, of course, that certain text features make more sense than others to include. A title is an example of a text feature, so maybe don't overthink this. You can look to include it in the writing that is connected to articles and hybrids, or speeches, which is a key feature in the oral language understanding around oracy. So they are required to give a speech in grade 6. So using it in conjunction with that particular text form from that other organizing idea, there's obviously going to be some text features that make more sense to include in a speech than others. Pictures make a lot more sense than a glossary. You could maybe use a graph or graphics or a map or a chart. But maybe you're not going to have a table of contents in your speech. So you can see where some lend themselves better to a certain form than others. So a couple of more ideas in relationship to text features. Use text with these features as mentor text whenever possible while students are crafting their own work to include particular text features. So if you want them to use sidebars and glossaries, bring in a bunch of texts that use sidebars and glossaries. Talk about why they're included. How do they add to the experience as a reader? You can also look at text features in other subject areas. Our science and social studies textbooks, if you happen to have one, or reference materials, have a lot of text features in them. And so if you can talk to them about text features and how they can level up their comprehension or understanding of the texts, that is time well spent. Okay, so let's jump into fiction. Again, here is how the understanding grows across the grades. In grade 4, we're looking at fictional texts, opening our minds to new possibilities and ideas. So students need to differentiate between a variety of fiction subgenres. We need to look for fictional texts that have main plots, subplots, or flashbacks. We're looking at elements within a variety of fictional texts. And so it, again, it might sound like you have a long list, but they actually tell us what those fictional texts are. So we're looking at traditional literature and fantasy. Just a little side note here, traditional literature is mentioned in every grade. So we need to be having conversations with our colleagues in other grades and deciding who is picking which traditional literature to look at, and making sure that students aren't studying fairy tales for 6 years in a row. Some of the elements of text include major and minor characters or point of view. And so you're going to look at some work around characterization. So some resourcing here. This is just a general guide around the genre. So if you're not sure what fantasy is, it tells you a little blurb there, and it also gives you some suggestions of subgenres of fantasy, keeping in mind that both of those could exist as novels, novels in verse, short stories, or picture books. So it's not always a novel that we need to look at. And we are going to look at the texts, these texts, for main plots, subplots, flashbacks, point of view, major characters, and minor characters. In grade 5, we are now switching things up a little bit, and we're including flash forward in our text structures. And the fictional texts that we're looking at include science fiction as a genre, tall tales, and traditional literature. Well, tall tales happen to be a type of traditional literature, so I've kind of been clumping those together. It also explicitly mentions folktale because tall tales are a type of a folktale, so that's why it's there. And then we're talking about characterization and how we get to know characters, and how we know more about a round character than a flat character. It also talks about theme. So themes are universal topics that are explored through the text. Examples of themes that you might encounter include friendship, love, death, courage, which could be connected to like the hero's journey, perseverance, overcoming obstacles. Those are all common themes that you might see in a text. And when we're asking students to think about theme, they just have to be able to justify their answer. So I think the theme of this text is this, and I think this because blah, blah, and blah. So we're really just encouraging them to look for reasons as to why they think that might be the theme. Again, here's some resources around these two little genres. And they could be found in novels, short stories, or picture books. Again, this isn't about finding a science fiction novel, although there's lots of science fiction novels out there. You could be finding a science fiction picture book that you want to explore with your students. Looking at a flash forward as an example, the best example that is quite common is in A Christmas Carol, where Ebenezer sees into the future what his life is going to be like, and then we come back to the real time. There is another example that you could show your students linked to this slide, which is at the very end of the Arthur cartoon, where we see forward into the future what all of them are going to be like as adults. So there's another example of flash forward. Theme, point of view, round and flat characters, and how we build out characters are all going to be elements that we look for within these particular genres. Now, in grade 6, it specifically mentions that we're looking at mentor texts. So we're looking at stories or examples of these texts where we can see these particular elements. We're looking at fictional texts to develop our empathy and inspire creativity. So you could then connect that piece to writing and that writing organizing idea. So when we look at the fictional texts, we are talking about traditional literature again and comedy this time. We've added another structure where you have a story within a story. We're still looking at characters and characterization, and we're talking about protagonists and antagonists, and how we identify them and those kinds of things. So again, you're going to notice a couple of links there. These two genres could be novels, short stories, dramatic works, poetry, or picture books. I've included a link to a complete novel study there for the Barren Grounds. It actually is an example of a story within a story. It includes many different connections to the curriculum, and so that's a ready to go resource for you to use. And again, all of these elements are what we're looking for when we're looking in or examining these two different genres in grade 6. Okay, so that brings us into nonfiction. Again, here's how nonfiction grows through the grades. In grade 4, our nonfiction texts include autobiographies, procedural texts, and land. So land is mentioned here as a nonfiction text. You remember in grades 5 and 6, it becomes its own little category for the cusps in this particular outcome. So we're looking at ways that nonfiction texts can be organized, specifically looking at procedural texts as an example. So that could be super fun to look at, I think. And here are some of the structures that nonfiction texts can have. You're going to have a conversation with your students about the types of facts and opinions that they can find in nonfiction texts. Maybe doing some sorting there of what is a fact and what is an opinion in the text that you're looking at. In grade 5, that nonfiction list has grown to include persuasive texts, editorials, and opinion pieces. We're looking at a couple of new structures, so larger topics with subtopics, or this idea of cause and effect. And again, we're discussing the variety of opinions regarding structure, content, or source of information in a nonfiction text. So if we're looking at an editorial or an opinion piece, what are the parts that are opinion? What are the parts that are information? Where is that information coming from? So being critical viewers or consumers of text is part of the work in grade 5. That continues into grade 6, where we're actually looking to analyze a little bit for accuracy. And so Students need to provide personal opinions regarding the structure, content, or source of information. So I like it. I didn't like it. This part was good. I think this part could be fixed. They need to confirm the accuracy of information presented in nonfiction text. So talking about ways that we can confirm the information that we're given, what is a reliable source, what is factual accuracy, and the nonfiction text include speeches, which links directly again into that oral language oracy piece. So you're going to draw some connections there. That takes us into poetry. Now, I've thrown some slides in from a different presentation. Poetry can be scary for some people to teach or work with. I've really been suggesting to teachers to consider using poems as a way to springboard your word study or your morphology work, because poets naturally have really solid word choice. Poems are usually pretty short, so you can read the whole text. And the more we expose students to poems, I think the more comfortable they'll get in working with poems and understanding that not every poem needs to be analyzed for its parts. So here are some places that you can find poems. Of course, some are going to be more appropriate for your context than others. Here is how the poetry understanding grows across the grades. In grade 4, the poetic structures that we need to look at include verse, free verse, and concrete poetry, which is sometimes called shape poetry. That might be how you're familiar with it. And students need to investigate figurative language. So we have to look at it, we have to understand it. And they need to experiment with creating some kind of a poem. So we're not expecting a poetic masterpiece from our grade 4 students. They just need to give it a whirl. Now, verse in itself isn't really a type of poetry. It's more like a structure that is used that has rhythm and rhyme. And so I wouldn't necessarily call it a type of poetry, but I would use a novel in verse to maybe explore this. And so remember, in grade 4, we're talking about novel as a structure. Well, what if we looked at novel in verse as a structure to touch on this poetry piece, but also managing that novel part? Again, some of these are going to be more appropriate than others for your students. We always recommend pre-reading any book that you're going to read with your students. Free verse happens to be my personal favorite. So here are some samples. Some will be more familiar or popular than others. There are many, many examples of free verse poems. There's no rhyme or rhythm. And so some students naturally gravitate towards them. Others like the rhyming feature, and so they don't enjoy free verse poetry as much. This link here will take you to a video where this person talks about how to build a concrete poem. Here are some text samples that you might want to consider checking out of examples of concrete poems. Thinking, of course, when it comes to this particular idea, is how does this particular form, so if we're looking at a concrete poem and the poem takes the shape of the idea, how does that engage our imagination? And how does it help us connect to other people, places, ideas, or emotions? So those can be, the understanding can be used to help build out questions that you use to have conversations with your students. In grade 5, lyric poetry is the poetry form that you have been given. So we're listening to poems in grade 5. They're asked to recite sing a poem from memory. Of course, this connects to that oral language piece. So we're going to align elements or expectations around oral language skills and procedures to this particular one. We're going to look at some figurative language. We're going to look at poetic structures, including stanzas. And again, they're going to experiment with creating a lyric poem. That doesn't mean it has to be a masterpiece. They just have to give it a whirl. So here are some things about lyric poetry. This particular green page will take you to a resource that it features some examples of lyric poetry. So essentially, lyric poetry is short-ish in the sense that it usually has no more than 60 lines. It's got some sort of a connection to the human experience. It uses figurative language playfully. It creates vivid imagery. There's a musical quality to it because it was originally set to the lyre. And so it was a poem recited while music was played. It grew over time to have different forms. So elegies, odes, and sonnets happen to be all types of lyric poetry. So again, when you click on that resource, you'll see a variety of examples of lyric poetry. One that might be of the most interest to students or the most fun to write might be an ode to an everyday object. So like an ode to my morning cup of coffee, an ode to my favorite blanket or sweatshirt, an ode to, I don't even know, my favorite socks. So writing some sort of recognition to a common everyday object that is set to some sort of rhyming pattern. In grade 6, we are creating poetry with various structures. Noticing it says ballads, poems, or songs narrating stories. So they don't have to write a ballad. They could write a different kind of poem or a song that tells a story. Weirdly enough, ballads tell stories. And so depending on if they choose to write a free verse or not, I guess that would be the different piece. They need to listen to, recite, or sing poetry. They need to look at a figurative language and how it develops empathy and inspires creativity. Investigating poetic structures that contribute to, so again, that's organization, right? How poems are organized. So a rhyme scheme, a stanza, that internal beat or rhythm. And they have to experiment with creating poetry. So again, no masterpieces, they just have to give it a whirl. A ballad tells a story and has some sort of a catchy rhythm or rhyme scheme. It might have a quatrain, which is a 4-line stanza. It doesn't have to. Rhyme scheme might be ABCB or ABAB. There's some sort of a musical quality, but it doesn't have to be put to music. And there's vivid imagery. If you want, you can have your students do an online search for modern ballads, and you're going to find songs by people they know that they could get excited about. So that's one option. You could also expose them to ballads that already exist. So I would not read the entire Raven with my students, but I am a fan of Poe's work. So I might read the first little bit and then watch the Simpsons episode where they redo the Raven. The Night Before Christmas is one that they might be familiar with as a ballad, as well as The Shooting of Dan McGrew or The Cremation of Sam McGee. Robert Service has a bunch of different ballads. And so you could also look at his work as an author focus, a poet focus, and look into some other ones that he has done or created. In the slide deck, you will have seen way more resources related to poetry, but for the emphasis of, or the point of brevity here, I've skipped through all of them. So take some time and dig in, because there's not only ideas of how you can work with and write poetry, but there's other resources and tools that you can use. So that takes us into drama for grades 5 and 6. Remember that we're just getting a taste, okay, of drama as a literary form, and baby steps and small tastes. So in grade 5, they need to understand that it's a literary form. So it's a text that give us stories and ideas. What they need to understand is that the main characters and the events in a drama piece are developed through the dialogue and the action. That's how the story moves forward. And so you can connect this to oral language in the verbal, nonverbal, verbal, and paraverbal pieces. But when it says examine main characters and events, what we're looking for is understanding that those things are developed through dialogue and action. So they have to listen to, read, or view a dramatic work to do this particular cusp. You can extend the understanding from the oral language piece around verbal, nonverbal, and paraverbal to examine artful expressions of ideas and stories. So in other words, how do those three things contribute to the story? Remember, you can watch, read, or listen to the dramatic work. So as they are doing this, this is the task they're given. How are the dialogue and action helping us understand the plot and getting to know the characters? So that's the purpose of the viewing. Underneath this slide, you will see some suggestions of radio plays, scripts, etc., that you might want to use for this particular cusp. In grade 6, we are looking at narrative structures in dramatic works, and we're focusing on comedy and tragedy. Really important first to point out that in a dramatic work, here is the text structure. So the exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. And we can compare that to the narrative text structure that they'd be familiar with from grade 5 language arts. And so how is it the same? How is it different? Spoiler alert, very similar. And so, but they need to be able to see that connecting piece. A couple of important elements related to this cusp. It says forms of drama, which means it can be a movie, a play that you actually watch or that you listen to, like a radio play, or a script. It's not black and white. Many stories include elements of comedy and tragedy. And it's really important for us to realize this is not about us teaching Shakespeare. So if students can understand the forms of drama and what these elements of comedy and tragedy look like, then we're hoping they're better prepared to engage in a more sophisticated text like a Shakespearean play when it's appropriate for them to do so. We always want to connect back to the learning outcome. So how does the text form and structure clarify information? So how does the fact that it is a TV show or a movie help us get information? And how does that fact that it's this particular text form help you build connections to yourself, others, and the world? And so this slide also includes some resources attached to it to help you work with different movies is the form of drama that we've selected, to understand how we can look for elements of comedy and tragedy in age-appropriate dramatic forms. That brings us to land. Again, we're just starting to look at land as its own theme in the text forms and structures in grade 5 and 6. In grade 5, we're asking students to make connections between the features of land and their personal experiences. And the knowledge explains how we do that. How do we make connections to land? We can connect this particular cusp to the oral language piece, where students are asked to discuss cultural contexts of oral traditions and the meanings of stories and lessons that are shared orally. So there's a direct link there. Another way that you can work with this particular cusp is to find a sit spot on your school property, or maybe you've got a path, a park path that is near your school that you take the time to walk and explore. Have a spot that you take your students to. Each student kind of finds their own little location and sit there. Be mindful in that space. What are all of your sensual senses experiencing in that space? and then ask them to write, draw, or tell about the connections they make in these visits and how that evolves throughout the year, how the space changes throughout the year, how they change throughout the year. And a few other things that you can do include sharing images of the land or inviting students to bring in pictures of their favorite places or seasons, what the images make them think of, talk about experiences they can recall when they see these pictures. As part of your ongoing classroom conversations, explore questions related to the land. What privileges do we get from this particular season that we can't get from other seasons? Or what do we think the land might be teaching us today? What can we learn from the land today? Everyone, whether we realize it or not, reads the land, reads the weather, reads what's happening around us environmentally. And so it's really about calling attention to that and being willing to have those conversations. Now, in grade 6, it shifts slightly because we're looking at specifically human-made structures by various groups of peoples. So it's not even just Indigenous peoples, but historically. And so this has been made as a resource or an activity that you can do with your students. You can connect it to one of the researching pieces that is part of the writing organizing idea, if you wish. But essentially, you ask them to look at some information about specific human-made structures, and you ask them to answer the question, how is meaning conveyed through this structure? So you might be getting into conversations around symbolism or historical significance. It's really quite broad. And I didn't include all of the items in the development of the resource because it says such as. So we are not required to look at every single one of these human-made structures of land. These are just suggestions. We do, however, need to look at how meaning is conveyed through the structures. So if you want to focus specifically on lob sticks or totem poles or pictographs, that's totally fine. You don't have to look at every single one of these. Ultimately, when we look at these 3 grades, you can see how this particular learning outcome becomes more complex. So all of them are talking about form and structure. In grade 4, we're talking about how the form and structure support or hold up the communications of ideas and information. Okay, that's the essential understanding piece that students need to walk away from in grade 4. In grade 5, it's form and structure, which also includes genre. And not only are we supporting communication of ideas and information, but we're also enhancing them. So we're talking about how that's when we choose a specific form and a structure, which then obviously informs the genre it's part of, it's done purposefully because that choice helps enhance our message or the ideas that we're trying to share. And then in grade 6, we're still looking at form and structure, and we're looking to clarify information and supporting connections with self, others, and the world. So we're really focusing in on a key purpose of text forms and structures and allowing students to explore those 2 pieces through the text that we select for them in their studies.